Europe is often hailed as the birthplace of the modern world. Children are taught in history class that civilizations such as the Greeks and Romans played a critical role to the development of today's society. In varying studies, such as literature, philosophy, trade, politics, and more, these empires were imperative. Even after these civilizations crumbled, history books follow the triumphs of various leaders across the continent that continued to bring power to Europe. However, some experts argue that these storylines leave out the darker side of early human history, a side in which Europe's contributions are praised, while those that they exploit are erased. One such historian argues that Africa has largely been ignored in modern history, despite its pivotal role as a catalyst for Western civilization. Howard French is a professor of journalism at Columbia University and the author of Born in Blackness: Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War.
The standard story that I had understood, and which I think we are all taught, is that this thing called the Age of Discovery in the 16th century or beginning in the late 15th century was about finding a maritime route to Asia, and that Africa, if it's mentioned at all, was just merely an obstacle or something, an inert entity with no intrinsic value that had to be sort of circumnavigated in order to reach Asia, which was the only point of interest to the Europeans. And this discovery, working on a book about China, bluntly contradicted that and showed that beginning in the early decades of the 15th century, the Portuguese had set out on a series of voyages down the African coast, convinced that the most important source of wealth in the world was not in Asia, but in Africa, in West Africa specifically.
In his book, French highlights the rise of Africa in the 14th century to one lesser-known historical figure called Mansa Musa. Musa was the great king and leader of Mali, one of the largest and richest empires in West Africa. Under his reign, the continent became a central hub for culture and trade.
Mansa Musa oversaw the transition of his empire from what is often crudely called animistic religions to Islam in this period in the early 14th century. And in 1324, Mansa Musa set off on pilgrimage to Mecca and transiting 3,500 miles of the Sahara, first stopping in Cairo, and carried with him 18 tons of gold, pure gold. Gold was the most important economic product of Mali by far, and as it soon became clear, Mali was the richest source of gold known in the world by far also at that time.
Musa's vast wealth, largely made up of gold, soon attracted the attention of Europe's leaders following his travels to Mecca.
So Mansa Musa shows up in Cairo with 18 tons of gold. No one had ever seen any individual or even kingdom in the possession of so much pure gold at any given moment. And he begins dispensing this gold in radical acts of patronage, handing it out almost, and giving it to potentates and to religious leaders and sometimes even common people along the way. And so much gold was distributed that this ended up depressing the price of gold on world markets. When I say world markets in this context, I mean throughout the sort of broad Mediterranean world. And so gold prices become depressed for about a decade or more, and word spreads quickly into Europe of this fantastic sovereign from Africa who controls unheard of amounts of gold. And this fires the imagination of Europeans in the latter part of the 14th century, meaning in the late 1300s.
French argues that stories of Musa's wealth and power are what kicked off the Age of Discovery in Europe, in which explorers would map and sail the world in search of this source of fabled gold.
The Portuguese in the early 1400s begin sending convoys of ships further and further down the coast of West Africa, looking for traces of this gold and having to overcome their own superstitions about the flatness of the earth and the dangers at sea, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, in 1471, a year which figures in the subtitle of my book, they arrive in what is now a modern nation called Ghana. On the coast, they discover, even among ordinary commoners, gold is so abundant that pretty much everyone seems to have some. And so this is their eureka moment. They have finally arrived, finding the thing that they had been obsessed with finding, and a few years later establish a gigantic trading center, which is fortified, and therefore let's call it a fort, at a place called Elmina. And it is my argument in this book that this is the real starting event of the modern age.
According to French, African gold wasn't the only resource the West grew rich on. The early 1500s marked the beginning of plantation agriculture that primarily took hold in Central Africa.
The plantation, as we know it under that term, was the most important economic innovation of the modern era prior to industrialization. In other words, no other innovation, economically speaking, as horrible as plantations were, even holds a candle to the impact that plantation agriculture had on the world.
In an effort to exponentially increase their production of sugarcane, Portugal became the first to adopt the exploitative system of plantation labor.
What happens in Sao Tome is that the scale of sugar production, the scale of these land estates that we call plantations, was vastly ramped up, and that enslavement became, for the first time in European history, entirely racialized. In other words, the only people put to work growing sugar in the sort of most punishing aspects of the growth of this crop were Africans.
The exploitation of Africans marked a grave era in history as slave labor expanded throughout Europe for centuries and eventually spread outwards.
Portugal, via its use of slave labor in Brazil using the prison labor camp, makes far more money over the next 100 years via sugar than Spain made in the capturing of gold and silver in the Americas. And even more dramatically, from the 1630s to the late 1600s, 1630 is the year in which England took control of the island, also at that time uninhabited, of Barbados in the Caribbean. From the 1630s, when England captures Barbados and then begins to grow sugar there until the 1680s or thereabouts, England also made more money extracting value from the forced labor of enslaved people growing sugar than the Spaniards did in all of the gold and silver trade.
French concluded with a reminder to the modern West that life as we know it would have never been possible without the resources and slave labor forcibly brought over from Africa.
4 times more Africans were brought to the New World than Europeans up until the year 1820. What does this tell us? This tells us that it was the labor of those Africans, often worked to death in plantations, this prettified term, sometimes worked brutally in other tasks, such as clearing of roads, digging of canals, felling of trees and forests, filling in of swamps, basically anything punishing or undesirable the Africans were consigned to doing. It was their labor that made this concept of a West viable. There could have been, along the timeline we're familiar with, no possibility of the development of a new world that would have been profitable in the scale that it turned out to be for Europe, of a West without an Africa. It was Africa and Africans.
Without experts like French taking time to study these lesser-known narratives and bring them to the surface, the same dominant storylines would be repeated throughout textbooks. It's important to remember that history is merely a recollection from humans, and sometimes an important perspective may have been overlooked. To find out more about this topic and our guest, Howard French, visit viewpointsradio.org. Also, check out his book, Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, and the Making of the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War, available online now and in bookstores. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Alex Winton. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. Studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson. Coming up next week.
There was a kid from South Philly, a third floor walk-up, that left me standing at mid-court before 10 or 11,000 fans.
One man's journey from fighting to play in the NBA to becoming Coach of the Year. Then,
for those kids' parents, that white t-shirt would have been seen as underwear. So for them to wear it out the house sort of by itself would have kind of raised eyebrows, which no doubt they were keen to do.
The evolution of the classic white tee. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows and find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints.